Hey guys! Tonight we're going to explore something that might seem impossibly mundane at first glance, but becomes absolutely fascinating the more you think about it. We're talking about laundry, specifically what it was actually like to wash clothes in Tudor England from roughly 1485 to 1603. Now, before you click away thinking this sounds boring, just consider for a moment how much of your life revolves around clean clothes. You probably do laundry once a week, maybe twice. You throw things in a machine, add some detergent, press a button, and walk away. An hour later, everything's clean. Then you toss it in a dryer, fold it up, and you're done. In Tudor England, doing the laundry was a full-day affair. Sometimes 2 days. Sometimes it took a week, and it was so physically exhausting that families would only do it a few times a year. Yes, you heard that right. A few times a year. So before you settle in for the night, go ahead and hit that like button if you're curious about history's everyday struggles. Subscribe if you enjoy this kind of content, but only if you genuinely want to. And let me know down in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. I always love seeing who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim your lights, get comfortable, maybe grab a glass of water or tea, and let's ease into this gentle journey through the surprisingly complex world of Tudor laundry. Trust me, by the end of this, you'll never look at your washing machine the same way again. Let's start with the most important question. Why was laundry such an ordeal in Tudor times? The answer is simple on the surface, but complicated when you dig deeper. There were no washing machines, no running water in most homes, no store-bought detergent, no dryers. The entire process, from start to finish, had to be done by hand, using materials you either made yourself or purchased at great expense. Imagine this. You're a typical Tudor housewife, or perhaps a laundry maid working in a wealthier household. It's early Monday morning, possibly around 4 or 5 in the morning, when the household begins to stir. You know that today is washing day, which means your back is going to ache, your hands are going to crack and bleed, and you're going to smell like lye and wet wool for the rest of the week. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. First, you need to understand what Tudor clothing was actually like. Most people in Tudor England didn't own very many clothes. A typical working person might have 2 or 3 outfits total, one to wear while the other was being washed or mended. The wealthy had more, of course, but even they didn't have closets bursting with options the way we do today. Clothing was expensive, really expensive. A good wool dress could cost the equivalent of several months' wages for a laborer. Linen shirts and shifts, the undergarments worn by both men and women, were slightly more affordable, but still represented a significant investment. Because clothes were so valuable, people took care of them. They patched them, mended them, and yes, occasionally washed them, though not nearly as often as we might expect. You see, Tudor people understood something that we've largely forgotten in our modern era of fast fashion and daily showers. Water, especially hot water, is hard on fabric. Every time you wash something, you're breaking down the fibers just a little bit. You're fading the colors, weakening the seams, shortening the garment's lifespan. So they washed carefully, sparingly, and only when absolutely necessary. The outer layers of clothing, the gowns and doublets and jerkins, were rarely washed at all. Instead, people would air them out, brush off the dirt and dust, and spot clean any obvious stains. It was the undergarments, the linen shifts and shirts that sat directly against the skin that needed regular washing. And by regular, We mean every few weeks or even every few months, depending on the household's resources and standards of cleanliness. This might sound disgusting to modern ears, and it probably was by our standards. But remember, Tudor people didn't sweat as much as we do today. They didn't have polyester and nylon trapping moisture against their skin. They wore natural fibers, linen and wool, which breathe and wick away moisture. They also changed their linen undergarments more frequently than their outer clothes, even if they weren't washing them. A fresh linen shirt, even if it wasn't perfectly clean, made a big difference in personal comfort and the appearance of cleanliness. But when washing day finally did arrive, it was an event, a production, an exhausting marathon that required planning, preparation, and a considerable amount of physical labor. Let's talk about why. Before you could even think about washing clothes in Tudor England, you needed to gather your supplies. This alone could take hours or even days, depending on where you lived and what resources you had access to. First and foremost, you needed water. Lots and lots of water. If you lived in a town or city, you might have access to a public well or a conduit, a kind of early public water supply. You'd have to carry your water home in buckets, pitcher by pitcher, which meant multiple trips back and forth. If you lived in the countryside, you might have a well in your yard, or you might have to walk to the nearest stream or river. Either way, every drop of water you used had to be carried by hand, and you needed a lot of water. To wash a household's worth of laundry, you might need 20, 30, even 40 gallons of water. That's a lot of trips to the well, a lot of time spent walking back and forth, sloshing water everywhere, feeling your arms burn and your shoulders ache. Once you had your water, you needed to heat it. This meant building up your fire, which in most Tudor homes meant the central hearth or a kitchen fireplace. You'd fill your largest pots and cauldrons with water and set them directly on the fire or hang them from hooks above the flames. Then you'd wait and wait and wait some more. Heating water over an open fire is not a quick process. It's not like turning on your electric kettle and having boiling water in 3 minutes. Depending on the size of your pot and the intensity of your fire, it could take an hour or more to bring a large cauldron of water to a boil, and you needed several cauldrons worth. While your water was heating, you needed to prepare your soap, and this is where things get really interesting. Tudor soap wasn't like modern soap. It wasn't a nice, mild, moisturizing bar that smelled like lavender or vanilla. It was harsh, it was caustic, and it was usually homemade. The most common type of soap used for laundry was called lye soap, and it was made from 2 main ingredients, lye and fat. Lye is a highly alkaline substance that's created by filtering water through wood ashes. You'd save the ashes from your fireplace in a special barrel or tub, then pour water through them slowly, collecting the liquid that dripped out the bottom. This liquid was lye, a powerful cleaning agent that could strip away dirt, grease, and grime from fabric. It could also strip away your skin if you weren't careful. Lye is incredibly caustic. It burns. It eats through organic material. Getting it on your hands meant painful chemical burns, cracked and bleeding skin, and long-term damage that never quite healed. This is one of the reasons why laundry maids and washerwomen often had hands that looked decades older than the rest of them. To make lye soap, you'd take your lye and mix it with animal fat, usually leftover cooking grease, tallow from butchering, or any other fat you could get your hands on. You'd heat the lye and fat together, stirring constantly until they combined through a chemical process called saponification. If you got the proportions right, you'd end up with a soft, jelly-like soap that could be stored in crocks or jars. If you got the proportions wrong, you might end up with something that was too greasy to clean properly or too harsh to use without destroying your clothes and your hands. Some households bought their soap instead of making it. There were professional soap makers who produced large batches and sold them at markets. But soap was expensive, and for many families, making it at home was simply more economical, even if it was time-consuming and unpleasant. In addition to lye soap, some Tudor washerwomen used other cleaning agents. Stale urine, for example, was prized for its ammonia content, which helped break down grease and set certain dyes. It sounds revolting, and it smelled even worse, but it worked. Chamber pots would be collected and aged until they reached peak pungency, then added to the wash water. There's also evidence that some people used a type of clay called fuller's earth, which absorbed oils and dirt from fabric. This was especially popular for cleaning wool, which couldn't be washed in hot water without shrinking. So there you are. You've spent hours gathering water, heating it over the fire, and preparing your soap. Your fire is blazing, your cauldrons are bubbling, and the entire house smells like wood smoke, lye, and possibly aged urine. Your arms are already tired from all the lifting and carrying, and you haven't even started washing yet. Now we get to the actual washing, which was, without exaggeration, back-breaking work. The first step was sorting your laundry. Just like today, you couldn't just throw everything in together and hope for the best. Different fabrics required different treatments, and different colors needed to be separated to prevent dye from bleeding. Linen undergarments, shifts, shirts, and handkerchiefs went into one pile. These were the items that needed the hottest water and the most vigorous scrubbing, because they were the pieces that came into direct contact with the body and absorbed the most sweat and oils. Wool items, outer garments, stockings, and caps went into another pile. Wool was tricky. It couldn't handle boiling water or aggressive scrubbing without shrinking and felting. It needed gentler treatment, cooler water, and careful handling. Then there were the delicate items, silk ribbons, embroidered collars, lace trim, and other fancy bits that required special attention. These might be hand-washed separately or even spot-cleaned rather than fully submerged. Let's focus on the linen first, since that's what most of the washing day was devoted to. You'd take your pile of linen items and place them in a large wooden tub or barrel. These weren't small containers. They were often big enough that you could almost climb inside them. Some households even had dedicated washing tubs that were used for nothing else. Then you'd pour in your hot water, or more accurately, you'd ladle it in cup by cup, trying not to splash yourself and scald your arms. Once the tub was full enough to cover the clothes, you'd add your soap. Not a capful like we do today, more like handfuls of the soft lye soap, or several cups of lye water, depending on what you had available. Now came the part that separated the strong from the weak, the actual scrubbing. In wealthier households, there might be a tool called a washing dolly or a posser, a long wooden pole with a kind of stool or cone shape at the bottom. You'd plunge this up and down in the tub, agitating the water and clothes, using the suction and pressure to work the soap through the fabric. But in most households, especially poorer ones, you used your hands. You'd reach into the hot, soapy water and grab a garment, pull it out, lay it over a washboard or a flat stone, and scrub it with a brush, or simply with your knuckles. Back and forth, working the soap into the fibers, trying to loosen the dirt and sweat and grime. This wasn't a gentle process. You were literally beating the dirt out of the clothes. Some washerwomen used wooden paddles called battledores to pound the fabric against a rock or a wooden board. The sound of washing day, the rhythmic thwack, thwack, thwack of fabric being beaten, was a familiar one in Tudor neighborhoods. And you did this for every single item, every shirt, every shift, every handkerchief and towel and sheet, one piece at a time, scrubbing and pounding and wringing until your hands were raw and your back was screaming. The water in the tub would quickly become grey and scummy, filled with the dirt and oils you were washing away. Once it got too dirty, you'd have to dump it out and start fresh with clean hot water. This meant more trips to the well, more time spent heating water over the fire, more work layered on top of work. And we're not even done with the linen yet. After the initial wash, you had to rinse everything. This meant filling your tub again with clean water, this time cold or lukewarm rather than hot. You'd take each item and swish it through the rinse water, trying to get all the soap out. If you didn't rinse thoroughly, the soap residue would stiffen the fabric and irritate the skin of whoever wore it next. One rinse usually wasn't enough. You'd do it 2 or 3 times, changing the water between each rinse until the water ran clear and the fabric felt clean and soft. Then came the wringing. Wet linen is heavy, unbelievably heavy. A single soaked sheet could weigh 10 or 15 pounds. You'd have to twist it as hard as you could, wringing out as much water as possible. Your hands would ache, your wrists would throb. Sometimes, if you had a helper, you'd twist from opposite ends, both of you pulling and turning until the fabric was damp rather than dripping. And then, finally, after hours of scrubbing and rinsing and wringing, the linen was ready to be dried. But we're not quite done yet. While the linen was the most labor-intensive part of washing day, wool presented its own unique challenges. Wool is a funny thing. It's warm, durable, and naturally water-resistant, which made it the fabric of choice for most outer garments in Tudor England. But it's also prone to shrinking, felting, and generally being ruined if you wash it wrong. The key to washing wool was gentleness and cooler water. You absolutely could not use boiling water on wool. Even hot water could be risky. Most Tudor washerwomen used lukewarm or even cool water for their wool items, and they handled them as carefully as possible. Instead of harsh lye soap, which could damage wool fibers, many people used urine or fuller's earth, as we mentioned earlier. Urine's ammonia content was particularly good at cleaning wool without the harshness of lye. The fabric would be submerged in a tub of stale urine, sometimes mixed with water, and left to soak for several hours. Yes, it smelled terrible. No, there was no way around it. This was simply how you cleaned wool if you didn't want to ruin it. After soaking, the wool would be gently lifted out, pressed to remove excess liquid, and then rinsed in clean water. No vigorous scrubbing, no pounding with a battledore. Just careful, methodical handling to preserve the fibers and the shape of the garment. Some wool items, particularly those that were heavily soiled or stained, might be taken to a professional fuller. Fulling was a specialized trade that involved not just cleaning wool, but also thickening and strengthening it through a combination of moisture, heat, and pressure. Fullers had large vats and specialized tools, and they knew exactly how to treat different types of wool without damaging them. But for everyday wool washing at home, the process was simply to soak, rinse, and press dry. It was less physically demanding than washing linen, but it required patience and a delicate touch. As for other fabrics, silk was rare and precious enough that most people never had to worry about washing it. If you were wealthy enough to own silk, you were probably wealthy enough to have servants who knew how to care for it, or you sent it to a professional. Silk couldn't handle water well at all. It would water spot, lose its sheen, and generally look terrible if washed improperly. Cotton was even rarer in Tudor England. It existed, imported from warmer climates, but it was expensive and exotic. Most people would never touch cotton in their entire lives, let alone have to wash it. So the bulk of washing day focused on linen and wool, with the occasional delicate item thrown in for good measure. And by the time you'd finished washing, rinsing, and wringing everything, several hours had passed. Your hands were cracked and bleeding from the lye. Your back ached from bending over tubs and scrubbing boards. Your arms felt like lead weights from all the lifting and wringing. But you still weren't done. Now you had to dry everything. In Tudor England, there were no dryers, no heated racks, no convenient ways to quickly dry a load of wet laundry. Everything had to air dry, which meant you were entirely at the mercy of the weather. On a warm, sunny, breezy day, drying laundry was actually one of the more pleasant parts of the process. You'd carry your armfuls of wet linen and wool outside and drape them over hedges, fences, bushes, and specially erected drying lines. The sun and wind would work together to dry everything relatively quickly, and there was something satisfying about seeing rows of clean, white linen flapping in the breeze. But Tudor England's weather was not always cooperative. In fact, it was frequently downright hostile. If it was winter, or rainy, or simply cold and damp, drying could take days. You'd hang your laundry inside, near the fire, hoping the heat would help evaporate the moisture. But indoor drying was slow and created its own problems. The house would become humid and stuffy. Everything would smell like wet wool and wood smoke. Clothes hung too close to the fire might scorch or even catch flame, which meant you had to watch them constantly. And if you lived in a small cottage with limited space, you simply didn't have room to hang a whole household's worth of wet laundry. Things would drip onto the floor, creating puddles and mud. They'd get in the way of cooking, eating, and sleeping. Children would bump into them and knock them down. Cats and dogs would rub against them and leave fur and dirt behind. Even outdoor drying had its risks. Sudden rainstorms could undo all your hard work in minutes, leaving you with clothes that were somehow dirtier than when you started. Birds might leave droppings on your clean linen. Dust and pollen would settle on damp fabric, staining it or causing it to need another rinse. Theft was also a real concern. Linen was valuable, and a thief could make off with a week's worth of your hard work if you weren't careful. Some households had designated areas for drying that were within sight of the house, or they'd take turns keeping watch over the laundry while it dried. In some areas, there were communal drying grounds, shared spaces where multiple households would hang their laundry. This made it easier to keep an eye on things, but it also meant you had to get along with your neighbors and respect each other's space and property. Certain items required special treatment when drying. Delicate lace or embroidered pieces might be laid flat on clean grass or stretched over wooden frames to prevent them from losing their shape. Wool had to be dried flat as well, since hanging it would cause it to stretch and become misshapen. White linen especially benefited from being dried in bright sunlight. The sun's rays had a natural bleaching effect that helped keep the fabric looking crisp and fresh. In fact, some households would deliberately lay their whitest linens out in the sun for days at a time, turning them regularly just to maintain that bright, clean appearance. This process was called bleaching, and it was considered an important part of maintaining a respectable household. Dingy, yellowed linen was a sign of poverty or slovenliness. Bright white linen signaled cleanliness, wealth, and good household management. But again, all of this depended on the weather cooperating. And in England, famous for its grey skies and frequent drizzles, that was far from guaranteed. So you'd do the best you could. You'd hang everything up, bring it in if it started to rain, hang it back out when the sun returned, turn things periodically to ensure even drying, and hope that by the end of a day or two, everything would be dry enough to fold and put away. By which point, of course, you were already exhausted and ready to never see another piece of wet laundry for as long as you lived. We've talked a lot about the process of doing laundry, but let's take a moment to really consider the physical toll this work took on the people who did it. In most households, laundry was women's work. Specifically, it fell to the housewife, her daughters, and any female servants the family could afford to employ. In wealthier households, there might be a dedicated laundry maid whose sole job was to handle the washing. In poorer households, the wife did everything herself, possibly with help from her children, and in towns and cities, there was an entire profession built around washing other people's clothes. These were the professional washerwomen, often widows or unmarried women who needed to support themselves and had few other options. Being a washerwoman was brutal work. It paid poorly, it was physically exhausting, and it destroyed your body over time. Remember the lye we talked about earlier? The caustic, skin-burning chemical that was essential for getting clothes clean. Washerwomen's hands were constantly exposed to it. Day after day, week after week, their skin would crack, bleed, and develop painful sores. Over time, the damage became permanent. Their hands would become gnarled and rough, with thickened skin that never quite healed. The constant bending, lifting, and scrubbing also took a toll on their backs. Many washerwomen developed chronic back pain, stooped postures, and joint problems that plagued them for the rest of their lives. This was work that aged you fast. Then there was the heat. Remember, all of this was done near a roaring fire, with steam rising from cauldrons of boiling water. In the summer, the heat was nearly unbearable. Washerwomen would be drenched in sweat, their faces red and flushed, struggling to breathe in the humid, smoke-filled air. In the winter, the work was somehow even worse. Your hands would be freezing as you wrung out clothes in icy rinse water, then burning as you plunged them back into hot wash water. The constant shift between hot and cold was torture on your skin and joints. And let's not forget the sheer monotony of it. Washing laundry wasn't a quick task you could knock out in an hour. It was an all-day affair, sometimes stretching into 2 or 3 days if the household was large or if the weather didn't cooperate. Hour after hour of the same repetitive motions. Scrubbing, rinsing, wringing, hanging. Your mind would wander, but your body kept working, mechanical and relentless. For professional washerwomen, this was their everyday. They'd take in laundry from multiple households, washing load after load, week after week, year after year. The work never stopped. There was always more laundry to be done, and the pay was terrible. Washerwomen were among the lowest paid workers in Tudor society. They charged by the piece or by the load, and even a full day's work might only earn them a few pennies. It was barely enough to survive on, and certainly not enough to save or improve one's circumstances. Many washerwomen were desperately poor. They lived in cramped, run-down housing, often in the less desirable parts of town. They couldn't afford to eat well, which meant they were often malnourished and more susceptible to illness. And because they were constantly exposed to other people's dirty laundry, they were also at higher risk of catching whatever diseases those clothes carried. Plague, typhus, dysentery, all of these could be transmitted through clothing and bedding. Washerwomen who handled the laundry of sick households were putting themselves in danger with every load they washed. And yet, they kept doing it because they had no choice. For many women, especially those without husbands or families to support them, washing laundry was one of the few ways to earn a living. It was hard, it was dangerous, it was poorly paid, but it was work, and work meant survival. While most laundry was done on a routine basis, there were certain occasions that required extra effort and created additional challenges. Weddings, for example, meant a flurry of laundry preparation. The bride's linens had to be spotlessly clean and as white as possible. Her shift, her stockings, her handkerchiefs, all had to be washed and bleached until they gleamed. The groom's shirt would receive similar treatment. In wealthier families, there might even be special wedding linens that were brought out only for the ceremony and the wedding night. These would be washed with extra care, possibly even sent to a professional launderer who could guarantee the best results. Births were another occasion that generated a lot of laundry. Childbirth in Tudor England was a bloody, messy affair, and it resulted in mountains of soiled linens that needed immediate washing. Birth sheets, towels, the mother's shifts, the baby's first swaddling clothes, all of it had to be laundered as quickly as possible. This presented a problem because the traditional washing day schedule might not align with when the birth occurred. If a baby was born on a Thursday, you couldn't just wait until Monday to wash the birth linens. They needed to be done immediately before the blood and other fluids could set and stain. So someone, usually a female relative or a hired washerwoman, would have to do an emergency wash, setting up tubs and heating water, and scrubbing linens, even if it wasn't the usual washing day. Deaths, too, required special laundry attention. When someone died, their body had to be washed and dressed in clean linens before burial. The bed linens and any clothes they'd worn during their final illness had to be laundered, both for practical hygiene reasons and because those items would be needed by the next person in the family. In cases of disease, especially contagious ones like plague or sweating sickness, there was genuine fear about handling the dead person's clothes and linens. People understood that disease could spread through contact with contaminated items, even if they didn't understand the exact mechanisms of infection. Some families would burn the clothes and linens of plague victims rather than risk washing them. Others would have them washed in the hottest possible water, with extra lye, and then dried in the sun for days, in hopes that the heat and light would kill whatever invisible danger lurked in the fibers. Seasonal changes also affected laundry routines. In the spring, there was often a tradition of doing a major household washing, cleaning all the heavy wool blankets and bed curtains that had been used throughout the winter. This was called spring cleaning, and it involved even more work than a normal washing day. Everything would come down: bed hangings, wall tapestries if you were wealthy enough to have them, curtains, cushion covers, table linens. All of it would be hauled outside, beaten to remove dust, washed if possible, or aired out if not, and then rehung once dry. This could take a week or more, and it usually involved the entire household. Even the men might be pressed into service for the heavy lifting and beating of large items. Similarly, in the fall, there was often a push to get everything washed and clean before the cold, dark winter made laundry even more difficult than usual. Wool cloaks and heavy blankets would be washed and then stored in chests with lavender or other herbs to keep moths away. Travel presented its own laundry challenges. If you were going on a journey, you had to pack enough clean linens to last the trip, because there was no guarantee you'd be able to wash anything while you were away. Wealthy travelers might bring a servant whose job was specifically to handle laundry during the journey, finding washerwomen in each town or city where they stayed. For common people, traveling usually meant wearing the same clothes for days or weeks on end, getting progressively dirtier and more uncomfortable until you finally returned home and could do a proper wash. Military campaigns were even worse. Soldiers and camp followers dealt with truly filthy conditions, and laundry was often impossible. Clothes would be worn until they literally fell apart, caked with mud, blood, and sweat. When armies finally settled in one place for any length of time, one of the first things that happened was a massive washing effort, with camp washerwomen charging premium prices for their services. One of the fascinating things about laundry in Tudor England is how much it revealed about a person's social status and wealth. The quality of your linens and how clean you kept them sent a clear message about where you stood in society. White linen, especially brilliantly white, was a status symbol. It showed that you could afford good quality fabric, that you had the resources to wash it regularly, and that you had the leisure time or the servants to dedicate to keeping it pristine. The nobility and wealthy merchants prided themselves on their fine linen. They wore white linen shirts and shifts under their outer garments, and they made sure that white collar or cuff was always visible, announcing to the world that they were clean, refined, and well-to-do. Poor people couldn't afford this. Their linen, if they had any at all, was often coarser, cheaper, and greyish rather than white. They simply didn't have the time or resources to keep it bleached and bright, and they certainly couldn't afford to change their linen daily or even weekly. This created a visible divide. You could look at someone on the street and immediately gauge their approximate wealth and status by the color and condition of their linen. The amount of linen you owned also mattered. Wealthy households would have chests full of sheets, towels, tablecloths, and napkins. They could rotate through their linen, using one set while another was being washed, and a third was stored away clean and ready. Poor households might own only 1 or 2 sets of sheets, if that, which meant that when washing day came, they either had to sleep on bare mattresses while the sheets dried, or they had to time their washing very carefully to minimize the inconvenience. The ability to have a designated washing day at all was a luxury. It meant you had enough clothes and linens to last between washings. If you only owned 1 shirt, you couldn't afford to spend a whole day washing it. You'd have nothing to wear. Some of the very poor would wash their single set of clothes at night, hanging them to dry by the fire, and pray they'd be dry enough to wear by morning. It was a precarious existence. The wealthy, meanwhile, could afford to hire professional launderers to handle their washing. They didn't have to expose their own hands to lye or spend their own time scrubbing and wringing. They could pay someone else to do that hard, unpleasant work. In fact, in the grandest households, there were elaborate laundry setups. Some noble estates had dedicated laundry buildings, separate from the main house, where professional washerwomen worked. These buildings would have multiple hearths for heating water, large drying rooms, special equipment like mangles for pressing linens, and storage areas for soaps and other supplies. The household linens in these estates were often marked with the family's crest or initials, embroidered in the corner so that pieces wouldn't get mixed up or lost. Inventories were kept. tracking every sheet, towel, and tablecloth, ensuring that nothing went missing. There were even rules about how often different items should be washed. Table linens might be changed and washed after every meal in the wealthiest households. Bed linens might be changed weekly or even more frequently for important family members and guests. Compare this to a peasant cottage, where the entire family might sleep on a single straw mattress with one rough blanket, and you can see how vast the difference was. Laundry was labor, and labor was expensive. The more you could afford to pay others to do your washing, the higher your status. The more you had to do yourself, the lower you were on the social ladder. This extended to things like soap. The poor made their own harsh lye soap from ashes and animal fat, while the rich could afford to buy fine imported soaps made with olive oil and scented with flowers or herbs. These soaps were gentler on the skin and left clothes smelling pleasant rather than like lye and wood ash. Even the water you used could be a status marker. The wealthy might have servants who brought fresh, clean water from the best sources for their laundry. The poor used whatever water they could access, which might be from a polluted river or a brackish well. All of these factors combined to create a world where something as simple as clean clothes was actually a complex marker of wealth, status, and social standing. While we've touched on the physical dangers of doing laundry, it's worth spending some time really examining the relationship between laundry and health in Tudor England. On one hand, washing clothes was important for hygiene and disease prevention. Dirty linens could harbor parasites like lice and fleas, which were not just uncomfortable, but also vectors for serious diseases like typhus. Regular washing helped control these pests, at least to some extent. The hot water and soap would kill lice eggs and wash away fleas. Hanging clothes in the sun to dry also helped, as the heat and UV rays had a sanitizing effect. But on the other hand, the washing process itself posed significant health risks, as we've discussed. The lye-burned skin, the constant exposure to hot water and steam could cause respiratory problems. The physical labor led to chronic pain and disability, and there was another, less obvious danger: the water itself. In Tudor England, water sources were often contaminated. Rivers and streams were used for washing, drinking, and dumping waste, often all at the same time. Wells could become polluted if they weren't properly maintained. Washing clothes in contaminated water didn't actually make them clean, it just made them wet and potentially more dangerous. If the water contained bacteria or parasites, those could transfer to the fabric and then to the skin of whoever wore those clothes next. This was particularly problematic with diapers and other baby linens. Babies have vulnerable immune systems, and exposing them to contaminated wash water could make them seriously ill. Some Tudor people understood this on an intuitive level. They knew that certain water sources were better than others. They preferred running water over still water, for example, because it was less likely to be stagnant and foul, but there was no scientific understanding of germ theory, so people didn't really grasp the full extent of the danger. They washed their clothes in whatever water was available and hoped for the best. Drying clothes properly was also important for health. Damp, mildew-covered fabric could cause skin irritation and rashes. It could also harbor mold spores that, when inhaled, might cause respiratory problems. But as we've discussed, drying was entirely dependent on the weather. In England's damp climate, it wasn't always possible to get things fully dry, especially in the winter. People would wear slightly damp or musty-smelling clothes simply because they had no alternative. This contributed to the generally unpleasant smell that characterized Tudor life. Without modern deodorants, washing machines, or climate control, people just smelled bad much of the time. Sweat, dirt, wood smoke, and musty fabric combined to create a fairly pungent personal aroma. The wealthy could mitigate this somewhat with perfumes, pomanders, and frequent changes of linen, but even they couldn't entirely escape it. Poor ventilation in most homes also meant that the smell of drying laundry, wet wool, and wood smoke would linger for days. Combined with the smells of cooking, chamber pots, and unwashed bodies, Tudor homes were often pretty fragrant, and not in a good way. There's also the question of how effective Tudor laundry methods actually were at removing dirt and bacteria. Modern detergents are specifically designed to break down oils and kill germs. Lye soap was effective at removing grease and some types of dirt, but it wasn't a perfect cleaning agent. Stains often remained even after washing. Blood, in particular, was difficult to remove completely, especially if it had dried and set into the fabric. Sweat stains would yellow white linen over time, no matter how carefully it was bleached. And while hot water and soap did kill some bacteria and parasites, they didn't eliminate everything. There was no bleach in the modern sense, no antibacterial agents, no way to truly sterilize clothing. So Tudor people lived in a world where their clothes were cleaner than if they never washed them at all, but still far from what we would consider actually clean by modern standards. This had real health consequences. Skin infections, rashes, and irritations were common, partly because of dirty clothes and bedding. Babies, in particular, suffered from diaper rash and other skin conditions that were exacerbated by inadequate laundering of their linens. And of course, there was the constant problem of lice. Everyone had them, from the poorest beggar to the richest noble. Washing helped control the population, but it didn't eliminate them entirely. People would sit by the fire in the evening, picking lice out of each other's hair and crushing them, as casually as we might scroll through our phones. It was just a normal part of life, an unavoidable nuisance that everyone dealt with. Despite all the hardship and difficulty, there was one aspect of Laundry Day that was actually somewhat positive. It was often a communal activity. In many villages and towns, women would gather together to do their washing. They'd meet at the river or stream, claim spots along the bank, and spend the day scrubbing clothes side by side. This served several purposes. First, it made the work a little less lonely. Doing laundry alone was monotonous and isolating. Doing it with other women meant you could chat, gossip, share news, and keep each other company. Second, it allowed for cooperation. If a load of washing was particularly heavy, you might ask a neighbor to help you wring it out. If someone ran out of soap, she could borrow a bit from someone else. If a child needed watching while his mother scrubbed clothes, another woman could keep an eye on him. These gathering spots became important social centers for women. While the men were out in the fields or at their trades, the women would meet at the washing place and exchange information. They'd discuss local news, offer advice on household matters, share remedies for common ailments, and build networks of mutual support. This is where reputations were made and broken. If someone was lazy about their washing, or if their linens were always grey and dingy, the other women would notice and talk about it. Conversely, a woman who kept her household linens bright and clean would earn respect and admiration. Washing day gossip could be quite powerful. Information spread through these informal networks, shaping public opinion and social dynamics in the community. There were also traditions and customs that grew up around communal washing. In some areas, there were particular days when certain groups of women would wash together. Servants might have one day, while housewives had another. This helped prevent overcrowding at popular washing spots. In towns with public washing facilities, like communal washing houses or designated areas along rivers, there might be rules about who could use them and when. Some were restricted to residents of particular parishes or neighborhoods. There could also be conflicts, disputes over access to the best spots, arguments about who had the right to use a particular section of the river, accusations of stealing each other's washing. All of these were common occurrences. Because remember, laundry wasn't just clothing. It represented a significant financial investment. Losing a good linen sheet to theft or damage was a serious blow to a family's resources. So people guarded their washing carefully and were quick to confront anyone who they thought was trying to take advantage. In larger households, washing day was also a communal effort within the household itself. The laundry maids might be the primary workers, but other servants would help out. Someone had to keep the fires going and the water heating. Someone had to help with the heavy lifting and wringing. Someone had to watch the drying clothes and bring them in if it started to rain. Even the lady of the house might supervise, checking that everything was being done properly, that the soap was being used efficiently, that the linens were coming out clean and white. This created a sense of shared purpose and teamwork, even in a hierarchical setting. Everyone had their role to play, and the work got done through collective effort. For professional washerwomen, though, the experience was different. They often worked alone or with one or two assistants, taking in laundry from various households and washing it in their own homes or in rented workshop spaces. This isolation meant they didn't always benefit from the social aspects of communal washing. They were more likely to be viewed as hired labor rather than as equals or neighbors, and because they handled other people's dirty laundry, there was sometimes a stigma attached to the profession. Still, even professional washerwomen would often form their own communities, sharing space at public washing facilities or along rivers, exchanging tips and techniques, and supporting each other through the difficult work. In some ways, Laundry Day was one of the few opportunities for women to gather together outside the home, to socialize and build relationships that extended beyond their immediate families. It was hard work, certainly, but it was also a space that belonged to women, where they could talk freely without male oversight, where they could form bonds and alliances, and where they could exercise a degree of autonomy and control over their own domain. Given how difficult and time-consuming laundry was in Tudor England, you might wonder whether there were any attempts to improve the process or develop new technologies to make it easier. The answer is yes, but only to a very limited extent. The basic tools of washing, tubs, washboards, dolly sticks, battledores hadn't changed significantly in centuries. They were simple, effective within their limitations, and didn't require any advanced technology to produce or maintain. There were some regional variations in washing equipment. In some areas, people used a tool called a rubbing board, which was essentially a piece of wood with ridges carved into it. You'd lay your fabric over the ridges and rub it vigorously, using the friction to work the dirt out of the fibers. In other areas, people preferred flat stones by the river, where they could pound and beat their laundry directly against the rock. Some washing tubs had built-in scrubbing surfaces or textured bottoms that made the work slightly easier, but these were minor variations on the same basic theme. One innovation that did exist, though it was rare and expensive, was the early mangle. This was a device for pressing and smoothing linens after they were washed and dried. It consisted of a large wooden roller or a set of rollers that could be cranked by hand to press fabric flat. Mangles were used primarily for tablecloths, sheets, and other large flat items. They helped smooth out wrinkles and gave the fabric a crisp, professional appearance. But they were bulky, expensive, and required a dedicated space, so only wealthy households or professional laundries had them. Most people simply smoothed their linens by hand, folding them carefully while they were still slightly damp so they'd dry with minimal wrinkles. Another area where there was some innovation was in soap making. While most people stuck with basic lye soap, there were professional soap makers who experimented with different ingredients and formulations. Castile soap, made from olive oil rather than animal fat, was highly prized for its mildness and pleasant scent. It was imported from Spain and was extremely expensive, making it a luxury item available only to the wealthy. Some soap makers also added herbs or flowers to their products, creating scented soaps that could be used for both bathing and laundry. Lavender, rosemary, and roses were popular choices. But for the average person, these fancy soaps were out of reach. They continued using their homemade lye soap and making do with what they had. There were also folk remedies and tricks that people used to make laundry easier or more effective. For example, some people believed that washing clothes during a full moon would make them cleaner and brighter. Whether this had any real effect is debatable, but it shows that people were always looking for ways to improve their results. Another common practice was to add various substances to the wash water to enhance cleaning or provide other benefits. Salt was sometimes added to help set colors and prevent dye from bleeding. Vinegar was used to soften water and help remove soap residue. Bluing agents, made from plants or minerals, were used to counteract the yellowing of white linens and make them appear brighter. All of these were attempts to work within the technological limitations of the time and achieve the best possible results with the tools and materials available. But there's no getting around the fact that Tudor laundry methods were primitive by modern standards. There was no mechanical assistance, no chemical engineering, no understanding of the science behind cleaning and sanitation. Everything was done through brute force, experience, and tradition. Knowledge was passed down from mother to daughter, from master to apprentice, in an unbroken chain stretching back generations. And while people certainly wished for easier ways to do the work, they also accepted it as simply part of life. This was how laundry had always been done. This was how it would continue to be done for the foreseeable future. It would be another 300 years before the first mechanical washing machines began to appear, and even longer before they became common household items. Let's take a moment to imagine what a complete washing day would actually look and feel like if you were living through it in Tudor England. You wake before dawn, while it's still dark outside. The fire in the hearth has burned down to embers overnight, so your first task is to rebuild it, adding fresh wood and blowing on the coals until the flames catch. While the fire builds, you start carrying water. Trip after trip to the well or the river, each bucket sloshing and heavy, your arms burning with the effort. You fill your largest pots and cauldrons, setting them on the fire or hanging them from hooks above the flames. As the water heats, you prepare your soap. If you've run out of lye soap, you might need to make a fresh batch, which means collecting ashes from the fireplace and filtering water through them to create the lye. If you have soap already made, you scoop it into a bowl and set it aside. By now, the sun is starting to rise. The rest of the household is waking up. Breakfast is a quick, simple affair, maybe some bread and ale, because everyone knows today is a working day and there's no time for leisurely meals. You sort the laundry into piles, linen here, wool there, delicates in a separate basket. You're mentally cataloguing every item, checking for stains that might need special attention, missing buttons that should be mended before washing. The water is finally hot, steaming and bubbling in the cauldrons. You start with the linen, filling your washing tub with the scalding water, adding soap, submerging the first batch of clothes. Now the real work begins. Hours and hours of scrubbing, rinsing, wringing. Your hands turn red and raw from the hot water and lye. Your back aches from bending over the tub. But you can't stop. There's too much to do. Around midday, you pause for a brief meal. Your hands are so damaged from the lye that even touching bread makes them sting. You eat quickly, aware that every minute spent sitting is a minute not spent washing. Then it's back to work. More scrubbing, more rinsing. The pile of clean, wet laundry grows. Your arms feel like jelly from all the wringing, but you keep going. If the weather is good, you start carrying the clean laundry outside to hang. Armful after armful, draping items over bushes and lines, spreading them out to catch the sun and wind. If the weather is bad, you have to improvise, hanging things inside near the fire, draping them over furniture, trying to create enough air circulation to help them dry. By late afternoon, you've washed everything you can. The fire is still burning, but the cauldrons are cooling. You're exhausted, your body aching all over. But there's still work to do. You clean up your workspace, dumping out the dirty wash water, rinsing your tubs and tools. You bank the fire so it doesn't go out completely, because you'll need it again tomorrow. Then you check on the drying laundry. You turn pieces over, rotate them so they dry evenly, bring in anything that's already dry, and hang up fresh items in their place. As evening falls, you finally sit down to rest. Your hands are cracked and sore, your back is screaming, your feet hurt from standing all day. You smell like lye and wet wool and wood smoke. Tomorrow, you'll have to check the laundry again. Bring in the dry pieces, fold them, put them away. Keep an eye on anything still drying. Probably do some mending, sewing on buttons and fixing torn seams before everything goes back into use. And in a few weeks or months, you'll do it all again. Because the laundry never truly ends. As long as people wear clothes and sleep in beds, there will always be more washing to be done. This was the rhythm of washing day, a rhythm measured not in hours, but in aching muscles and cracked hands, a rhythm that countless women lived by, generation after generation, for hundreds of years. While we've focused on Tudor England, it's worth noting that laundry practices varied somewhat across different regions and cultures during the same time period. In Mediterranean countries, where the climate was warmer and sunnier, outdoor drying was more reliable. Washing could be done more frequently without the worry of endless rainy days preventing things from drying properly. In these areas, communal washing fountains were common. These were often elaborate structures with multiple basins and running water, built specifically for laundering. Women would gather there to wash their clothes, and these fountains became important social spaces. Some Italian cities had professional guilds for washerwomen, which gave them a degree of organization and protection that their English counterparts lacked. These guilds regulated prices, ensured quality standards, and provided support for members who fell ill or became unable to work. In France, there were similar communal washing structures called lavoirs. These were often covered shelters built along rivers or over natural springs, providing washerwomen with some protection from the weather while they worked. In colder northern European countries, the challenges were similar to those in England. Short summers, long dark winters, and frequent rain made laundry difficult and time-consuming. People in Scandinavia and Germany dealt with many of the same issues we've discussed: frozen washwater in winter, slow drying times, and the need to dry things indoors near the fire. In some parts of Europe, there were different cultural attitudes toward cleanliness and laundering. The Dutch, for example, had a reputation for being particularly fastidious about cleanliness. Dutch housewives were known for their spotless homes and gleaming white linens, and washing day was taken very seriously. In other areas, standards were more relaxed. What counted as acceptably clean in one place might be considered filthy in another. There were also different laundering techniques. In some regions, people used a method called bucking, which involved soaking linen in lye water in a special bucket or barrel, then pouring boiling water through it repeatedly. This was thought to be particularly effective for getting linens very white. In areas with access to certain types of clay or mineral deposits, people used these natural resources as cleaning agents. Fuller's earth, as we mentioned earlier, was used in England and other parts of Europe. In other places, different clays or sand were used for scrubbing. Religious practices also influenced laundry customs. In Christian areas, washing was often avoided on Sundays and holy days, which were supposed to be days of rest. This meant careful planning to ensure washing day didn't fall on a prohibited day. In Jewish communities, there were specific rules about cleanliness and ritual purity that affected when and how laundry was done. The preparation for Sabbath often included washing and changing into clean clothes. Muslim communities in Spain and North Africa had their own bathing and laundering traditions, often influenced by Islamic emphasis on cleanliness and ritual washing. Public bathhouses in these areas sometimes included facilities for washing clothes as well as bathing. Despite these regional and cultural variations, the fundamental reality was the same everywhere. Before the Industrial Revolution and the development of modern washing technology, doing laundry was hard, time-consuming work that fell primarily on women's shoulders. Whether you were in London or Florence, Paris or Amsterdam, the basic process was the same: gather water, heat it, add soap, scrub, rinse, wring, dry. Repeat endlessly for your entire life. As we come to the end of our exploration of Tudor laundry, it's worth taking a moment to reflect on what we've learned and what it tells us about history more broadly. Laundry is one of those subjects that seems trivial at first glance. It's domestic, it's mundane, it's not about kings and battles and great historical events, and yet, when you really dig into it, it reveals so much about how people actually lived. It shows us the daily reality of women's work, the physical toll it took, and the skill and knowledge required to do it well. It illuminates social hierarchies and economic structures. It connects to broader themes of health, hygiene, technology, and cultural values. Most importantly, it reminds us that history isn't just about the grand narratives. It's also about the small, repetitive tasks that filled most people's lives. The things that nobody bothered to write down because they were too ordinary, too familiar, too boring. But those boring things mattered. They shaped people's days, their bodies, their relationships, their sense of self. A Tudor woman who spent her life doing laundry probably didn't think of herself as making history. She was just trying to keep her family clothed and her household running. Yet in doing so, she was part of the vast machinery of daily life that kept society functioning. Without all those women, scrubbing clothes in rivers and tubs, Tudor England would literally have fallen apart. The fabrics would have rotted, the parasites would have overwhelmed everyone, and life would have become impossible. So when we look back at the Tudor period, yes, we should remember Henry V and Elizabeth I, the Spanish Armada, and the Protestant Reformation. But we should also remember the unnamed women with raw, cracked hands, bent backs, and wet skirts, standing by riversides and hearthfires, doing the unglamorous work that made everything else possible. Their labor was invisible in the historical record, but essential to human existence. And understanding it helps us appreciate both how far we've come and how much we owe to those who came before us. The next time you toss a load of laundry into your washing machine, maybe take a moment to feel grateful. Grateful for technology, yes, but also grateful that you're not standing in freezing water, scrubbing clothes with lye soap that's eating through your skin, wondering if the rain will ever stop long enough for things to dry. That was the reality for countless generations of people, and now it's not. That's real progress, measurable in saved hours, saved labor, and saved pain. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the surprisingly complex world of Tudor laundry. I hope you've learned something, and I hope it's helped you drift off into restful sleep, or at least given you a new appreciation for modern conveniences. Sleep well, everyone, and may your dreams be filled with clean, fresh-smelling linens and washing machines that never break down. Until next time.